Well, let's stay on the topic of AEW. Our next question sent in the CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Charlie in Starkville, Mississippi.
Oh, for God's sake. You get right this quick.
This question is from Charlie.
This is from Charlie, mac and cheese eating Charlie in Starkville, Mississippi.
This question is from Charlie in Starkville, Mississippi. What are your thoughts on AEW fans' recent complaints that referee Aubrey Edwards is too distracting and taking the spotlight off of the wrestlers?
What? That's the whole thing that we talked about is how she does her shit, but she doesn't get in the way of the match. The only time she would be taking spotlight away from the wrestlers is when there were some pretty shitty wrestlers, to me. I mean, have you noticed that it's like she's hot dogging or glory hogging somehow?
I have not thought that, but apparently, based on this email from Charlie, AEW fans must be complaining somewhere in the social media world.
Well, it's AEW fans wouldn't know what fucking wrestling was if it bit them in the face or bit their nose off anyway. But no, she keeps her game face on. She treats it seriously, except when they just completely bury her with doing stuff out in front of her that she obviously can't do anything about because it's not supposed to happen that way. And they didn't used to do that, but they've started doing it a little bit lately, like they've, done to every other referee since the start. But I don't see her taking away from anything. I see her adding to it because she's always there and official. And she looks good. It's not like she's fucking overweight or sloppy or fucking just stands there and waves her hands in the air and doesn't try to do anything about anything. Old dish raggy, body language. She's doing a good job, in my opinion. Nice authoritative counts, whatever the fuck.
I recently read something somewhere, and I thought it was so stupid, and I don't even remember where. But it was a similar complaint. Someone was going back through old episodes of Nitro, and they said, that referee Mark Curtis does too much. He's distracting from the match. And I'm like, he was the best referee in the business. What are you talking about?
I don't.
Are there guys you could think of that distract from the match? Are there referees you could think of?
I will say that when I was a young fan in Louisville, Thomas Marlin was so overly babyface that he killed fucking heels heat off in a second because he wouldn't put up with bullshit. You couldn't even. It was like you had to drive a fucking 18-wheeler in the ring to distract him because he didn't want to turn his back on any fucking heel shenanigans because he was just straight babyface. He was a member of the Marlin family and he was a judge down in Tennessee and then every once in a while, if they did let some heels get some heat, he'd want to be in on the angle, and they'd do a deal with him where the heels would bump him, and he'd make a comeback on the heels. We'd come back in a 6-man tag or whatever the following week. They did that once with me, with Adrian in Louisville, and Thomas Marlin. He was 50-something years old at the time, gray-haired. 5'10" and pot belly, but hard as a rock. His forearms, he hit me harder than Road Warrior Animal ever hit me. I saw stars from a broad arm to the chest. Every once in a while, especially, Bronco Lube. What?
I was about to say, what about David Manning? You went to Bronco, but I was about to say, what about David Manning?
I swear to God, I was about to say Bronco Lubitsch was a giving referee, but he just physically couldn't get up and down anymore. So you could distract him, but it was tough because he couldn't move quick and he couldn't do a lot of false finishes. But David Manning was the ultimate babyface referee in world class in Dallas. Because he was in the office, he was friends with the boys, he was in all the booking meetings, he was the go-to guy, he was the guy that drove out to Fritz's and told him that David was dead in Japan, whatever the case, right? But he wanted to be straight babyface, and you couldn't get away with it unless you really worked for it, and especially if it was called for in the finish, he had to put up with it, but he didn't like heat. Carl Fergie, when he was refereeing in Louisiana, he didn't give a shit either way, right? Because he got a job. They didn't have a spot for him as a wrestler, so Dundee made him a referee. And every time I'd jump up to distract him in the finish while the boys were doing something behind his back, I'd be up there and he'd come over and he'd start like he was telling me off, but he'd really be saying, "Oh, Corny, come on, let me turn around. You're killing my blowjobs." And right then the boys would be finished because, he's going to get heat with the people. You're killing my blowjobs, Corny. And right then the boys would be finished with whatever, but the fucking babyface would have foiled them. And I would say, okay, Fergie, get your fucking blowjobs back. And he'd give me a big shove off the apron and turn and count the pin for the baby faces and a big pop. And he'd be happy because he got his blowjobs back. But yeah, most of the time, if it was a long-standing referee in a territory that was figured into the office or, either part of the booking office or just figured into doing office work and office stooging, then chances are they were more often than not tried to be portrayed as baby faces. But in some places like Louisiana, no, you couldn't get away with that because Watts wouldn't have taken a prima donna fucking referee. And guys like when I was there, Ronnie West, when he was the top referee, he loved to take bumps. He loved to let the heels get heat. He loved that shit because it was wrestling. When he refereed for Nick Goulas in Chattanooga back in the early 70s, and Chattanooga was it's still not the biggest metropolitan area in the world, but back then it's a mountain town of 100 and something thousand people, maybe. And wrestling was on one of the 3 TV stations in town, and they drew, 3 or 4 or 5,000 people every Saturday night at the Memorial Auditorium. Ronnie West is from up the road in Cleveland, Tennessee. So he's a local boy. And now he's become the referee, and he was helping out in the office then. But when they would do an angle with Don and Al Green or the interns or whatever, the Von Brauners, whatever heel team, they'd fucking beat the fuck out of Ronnie West, and he'd get color. And then the babyface would come and save the other babyfaces and the referee, and the heels would take off. And then Ronnie would have gone so fucking far with it that he had to get a few stitches, and he'd get sewn up, and then he would go out the next week. Every day he'd try to go to 3 or 4 different fucking bars or diners or whatever in downtown Chattanooga and just sit there with that fucking mopey face he would get. Because Ronnie West JR used to call him the lost pile cousin. There was Gomer, there was Goober, and Ronnie. And the way that Ronnie talked, because he was so fucking country, and instead of saying whatever, he'd say ever what. He'd say, now I told him do this, do that, or ever what. And he would sit there at the bar or at a counter or talk to a waitress or whatever until somebody noticed this big gash on his fucking head and all the mercurochrome all around it and everything. And they'd say, well, what happened to you? Oh, the no good Von Brauners or whoever it was. He hit me with a blackjack or he did this or that. Saturday night at the auditorium, there's a return match. And I'm going to referee that one. And it's 2 out of 3 falls this time. And he would go out and promote the matches that way with showing his fucking gashed in head and blaming the heels for it. That was how old fashioned Ronnie West was. And it worked. Because people would all get out and they would start talking and they would go home and say, I saw the referee off TV wrestling today. You should have seen the fucking cut on his head. Those goddamn Green brothers must have killed him. And it worked. There was nothing else going on in fucking Chattanooga in 1972. Babyface referees is what we were talking about.
Well, Aubrey Edwards is the best referee today, and Mark Curtis was the best referee in the 90s. Tommy Young, I'd say, was the best referee before that. So let's talk about him because
Tommy was the best of all time.
Did you ever hear complaints from any wrestlers about Tommy Young that he was outshining the wrestlers or trying to steal attention? Was that something that anyone ever complained about?
No, all the top guys wanted Tommy to referee their match. Because, especially in those days, of course, we had Earl Hebner, and Earl was a good referee then. And, even he was not as experienced as he was, fucking in the 90s and thousands or whatever, and a legend, but he was a good local referee. Like I said, Ronnie West was a great referee. Nick Patrick was a good referee because he was Jody Hamilton's son. He'd started out at training to wrestle and then hurt his knee real bad and had switched to refereeing. So he knew the business. Hildebrand, Mark Curtis, stole a lot of stuff from Tommy Young. And also in the early Smoky Mountain days, because Brian had refereed a time or two before, but he had wrestled independently and managed more than he had refereed. I needed to give him a full-time job if I was going to have a territory. So he fit refereeing best. But for the first 6 months, Tommy Young was there as my agent and was helping Brian just with the referee thing, with little critiques. But Brian was such a huge fan. He was so athletic. He knew how to work, but he also knew what the shit was supposed to look like. And he just hit that niche, and he was the best. But Tommy, all the guys wanted him to referee because, even when we didn't have just athletic commission referees or local referees, and that would kill you. When we first went to New York State for Crockett in 86-ish or whatever, the New York Athletic Commission insisted on assigning the referees. And Tommy Young was there because he was on the loop, but he was sitting ringside with the announcer playing the music on a boombox, and we had some 70-year-old part-time fucking New York Athletic Commission referee in the match with the Midnight Express and fucking rock and roll. Right? So I thought the guy was going to have a stroke, and it was killing the fucking match. He couldn't keep up. He didn't know what the guys were doing. He'd been refereeing when fucking Gorilla Monsoon was on top as a rookie, right? This guy. So he just he couldn't get it. He couldn't get the match. And the athletic commissioner was there, and I looked down at Tommy. I said, the best referee in the business is playing music, and we got Methuselah in our fucking match. But everybody wanted Tommy because he knew exactly where to be, when to be there. He could instantly carry spots across the ring and back, in between a manager and a wrestler, or partners on the opposite ends of the fucking aprons. He was official in everything. His timing was perfect. He never got in the way. When he did get in the way, and it wasn't even his fault, it just when wild shit would be going on, and some guy would, somebody would take a bump and clip the side of his leg, he'd go with it, but he wouldn't take a stupid bump. He'd go down with his legs out from under him, but he'd grab the top rope like, oh my gosh. So he's not knocked goofy, but it's like shit's happening in the ring. He just was so reactive. But no, none of the guys ever thought he was stealing attention, because everything he did was meant to magnify what you were doing in the ring and to make it look legitimate at the same time. He gave you room to do all the shit you were supposed to do, but at the same time, he looked like he was trying to do something about it. He could be distracted, but the thing is, if you didn't distract him quickly, then the heat would go on him instead of you, but that's your fault. But his timing was so good, and we got to work together so well, that I would always wait. If there was a spot where I needed to draw Tommy, but I knew that first Bobby was going to have to hit the ropes on the far side and then hit the ropes on the near side before the fucking whatever was going to happen, I'd let Bobby hit the ropes on the far side first, and then I would get in motion on the other side of the ring, and I'd jump up and raise my racket up in the air to distract Tommy's attention so that he would turn around right as Bobby was hitting the ropes on the near side, so that whatever they were going to do, it was going to happen behind his back, and then I would jump down, and he would literally have turned around to me for 1 second and then complete the turn, and everything was done. It was that... It wasn't like just draw the guy and keep him there for 6 years while this fucking heat goes on behind the referee's back and the tag partner is buried and useless because he's not allowed to come in and do anything. We tried to make it plausible and quick and in the right spots, and Tommy was always right there. So he just, to this day, there's nobody that adds to a match and understood it and could do whatever was necessary like Tommy. He just fell into it as being the referee savant of the wrestling business. And he trained as a wrestler, just real quick. He's been on the show before. That may be on Patreon sooner or later.
It actually already is on Patreon.
Well, there you go. Well, then in that case, give the Patreon plug, Brian.
Patreon.com/Cornette. Another batch of classic episodes goes up each and every Sunday evening.
He trained to be a wrestler at first, and he was abysmal at it. He admitted himself he was fucking horrible and would never have gone anywhere. But he filled in as a referee and got good feedback, and that's how that started. And, so sometimes it's just positioning. But anyway, that's the case with Thomaston.